As you all know, we've now entered into a war in Iraq and Syria. No matter what we call it, that's what's happening. We're doing hundreds of bombings of those two countries. Now, of course, we say we're attacking ISIS and some other alleged groups. And in that bombing, unfortunately, some civilians are killed. Now, President Obama recently announced a policy on drone strikes where we had to be very certain, I'm going to tell you the exact standard in a second, before we shot at people because we didn't want to kill civilians. That makes sense. They're now lifting that policy. So we go to Yahoo News, old friend of ours, Michael Isikoff, writing this story, explaining. The White House has acknowledged for the first time that strict standards President Obama imposed last year to prevent civilian deaths from U.S. drone strikes will not apply to U.S. military operations in Syria and Iraq. Oh, great. So we won't have strict standards and we will kill more civilians. In fact, we already have. Isikoff explains. A White House statement to Yahoo News confirming the looser policy came in response to questions about reports that as many as a dozen civilians, including women and young children, were killed when a Tomahawk missile struck the village of Kafr Daryan in Syria's Idlib province on the morning of September 23rd. Okay, so what was the old policy? Well, they explained that it was barring U.S. drone strikes unless there is a, quote, near certainty that there will be no civilian casualties. Now that we're in the middle of a war, which we're not necessarily calling a war, and we're doing so many more bombings, that's all right, we don't have to be certain. Some civilians die, what am I going to do? I got to keep bombing. I got to keep bombing more and more. Who needs certainty? Okay, the new policy is called proportionality and distinction. The number of people who understand what that means is approximately 0. Okay, I understand what proportionality means, but what does that standard actually imply? All right, well, here's the explanation. The laws of armed conflict prohibit the deliberate targeting of civilian areas and require armed forces to take precautions to prevent inadvertent civilian deaths as much as possible. So that's our new standard. A lot of civilians are going to die. We'll try the best we can within certain bounds. I mean, I'll check once. I'm not going to double check, okay? And when you don't double check, you fire a Tomahawk missile and kill 12 civilians, including kids. I like the old standard where we double checked. Now, to give you a sense of how troubling this is, you remember when President Obama changed the policy? Now, because remember, our drone policy earlier was, who cares? Civilians, not civilians. We just bomb them, right? In fact, we based most of our strikes on signature strikes, meaning that we did not know who we were bombing. We had signatures of cell phones, weapons. A lot of times we bomb weddings because people bring weapons to weddings and fire them in the air. Big mistake. Here comes a Tomahawk missile or a drone strike, right? So it was a little haphazard. In fact, the president kept saying over and over how he had to authorize all those strikes. It turns out that wasn't true. Actually, the military could authorize a lot of strikes. Under the new standard that lasted for a couple of months, then yes, the president had to authorize all the strikes. And that's where we brought it down a little bit. And at the time, President Obama had said, for me and those in my chain of command, those deaths will haunt us as long as we live, referring to the civilian casualties. Now, he didn't say it, but it appears, based on the change in policy, that his new thought is, well, it's not going to haunt us that much. Now, I know what a lot of people think. Hey, war is hell. Well, then that's why we should put a lot of thought before we go into the next one. And here we are, and we've put no thought into it. We've got no congressional authorization. The country certainly didn't vote on it. They voted for a president who was going to end the wars in the Middle East. Instead, we got a president who started a new war with no authorization, then turns around and says, yeah, we will kill civilians more indiscriminately, but what am I going to do? Well, what you could do is the old standard that you had for a couple of months, and what you could do is not keep going into Middle Eastern wars, among many other options. Okay, so no, they've taken the brakes off, and here comes more indiscriminate bombing. And I bet those people that we killed, their family members won't turn against us. They'll say, oh, well, that's understandable collateral damage. Well, they've got a new policy, and the new policy is more indiscriminate killing of civilians. We understand America's bringing us freedom. I'm sure that's what they'll think. Now, lest you think that it's just President Obama, in a House hearing on this issue, Republican Adam Kinzinger from Illinois was asked about it, and he had this very thoughtful and considerate quote. "I did hear them say that there were civilian casualties, but I didn't get details. But nothing's perfect. Whatever civilian deaths resulted from the U.S. strikes are much less than the brutality of the Assad regime." Oh, I see. We're a tiny bit better than the brutal dictator Bashar Assad. Oh, okay. Well, that is a wonderful new doctrine that we Americans can be very proud of.